Hey, welcome to this video tutorial. In this video, you are going to learn about the 5 common mistakes that you should avoid as a Python developer. In this video, I'm going to just explain the reasons why you should avoid these 5 common mistakes from your Python program. The first one is avoid using global variables. Basically, global variables are accessible and can be modifiable globally. So using global variables can make your code harder to maintain and understand, as they can be modified from anywhere in your Python program. And instead, using local variables and pass them as uh, uh, arguments to functions or class methods. For example, let's try to see this example. This is the bad code because the age variable is defined globally and it can be accessible everywhere in the Python program. So and it can be modifiable everywhere in your Python program. So this is the bad thing. It is harder to understand and even harder to maintain your code. And instead of using global variables, you have to use local variables, and you can pass as an argument to a function. It is defined in the local variable, and this variable is only accessible inside this function. It is not be accessible outside the function. That is the good. And even if the security perspective, so it is strongly recommended to use local variables instead of global variables. This is one a reason that you should avoid using global variables in Python program. Good. The second method is that you should avoid blocking input-output operations and use non-blocking I/O operations instead, because blocking input-output operations make your code slower and less responsive. So use non-blocking input-output operations or asynchronous programming techniques to avoid blocking input-output operations. Because, for example, if you wanna just get or fetch data from websites and using request methods, so this make your code slower and less responsive. So instead, you have to use non-blocking input-output operation, that is asynchronous programming technique. That is the best practice that recommended to use non-blocking input-output operations instead of blocking operations. So this is the second common mistake that you should avoid while developing your Python program. Go ahead. The third is avoid using eval and execute functions, because those functions are make your code less secure, especially the security perspective. Those two methods are very less secure than the other methods. So you have to avoid using those methods, because those methods can make your code less secure, as they can execute arbitrary code, and instead use safer alternatives such as literal eval functions. Okay, let's try to see an example. This is the bad thing. For example, this eval function basically used to evaluate literals. So this evaluates 1 plus 1. Without eval function, it is difficult to evaluate, because it's just it is a string literal, and you have to just pass this to the function eval. But instead, use ast or st module that is a literal eval function. So this is the best and good practice that especially that make your code secured. Okay. And the fourth one is avoid using mutable default arguments, especially if the default arguments are mutable, which means can be modifiable. That is not a good practice. So you have to avoid mutable default arguments from your Python program, because can cause unexpected behaviors. We can see an example that cause unexpected behaviors in mutable default arguments. Let's see. This is my func1 in this the default argument is my list. It just define an empty list, and I just append one to this list and return the list item instead. Then I call this 2 times. If I call this function 2 times, then the uh, list item is just literally changed because I just appended one at a time, but when you call many times, it just appended that one many times because of I already defined a mutable default argument. This default argument is can be changed the values over time. Okay, so this is bad practice. You have to avoid using such kind of mutable default arguments and instead use a mutable default argument. Let's say you can assign none value for your default argument, and if that's uh, uh, argument is none, just assign an empty list to that argument. Otherwise, it just append one. Whenever you call this function, many times it just not change the values because I already appended one at a time and it will not change that value. So this is good practice. So you have to avoid using mutable default arguments. Instead, use immutable default arguments. The fifth one and the last common errors that you should avoid from your Python programs as a Python developer is avoid using Argus and Qargus excessively because they are very harder to understand and maintain. Using Argus and Qargus can make your code harder to understand and maintain as it can be difficult to determine the expected outputs or arguments and their types. Instead, use named arguments in default values to make your code more readable, especially if you wanna just make your code more readable, you can use named arguments instead of Kyorg or default like Argus and Kyorgus. So, for example, this is so it is hard to understand, even maintain. Instead, you can use named arguments like arg1, arg2. You can pass default value to this named argument, and you can change that default value anytime in the function call. Okay, so those are the most common errors that you should avoid as a Python developers. I hope you enjoyed in this video tutorial, and don't forget to like, share, subscribe my YouTube, and you can also support my YouTube by joining as a membership, and you can also send thanks gifts. Thanks for watching today.